The names I'll use aren't real, and there's a good reason for that. What happened in those deep woods is something I'll never forget, and something that should never be rediscovered. All I'll say is that it took place somewhere deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. That's all the detail you need to know. For the purpose of this story, you can call me Kevin. I'm not much of a storyteller, but I feel like I need to get this out. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's just that I can't sleep anymore without seeing. You know what? Let me not get ahead of myself. Either way, here goes nothing. It all started with my girlfriend, Kelly, convincing me to join her and her friends on a camping trip. I wasn't exactly thrilled about it. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't a stranger to the outdoors. I grew up hunting and fishing in Texas, so roughing it wasn't the issue. But camping with a group of 8 people, most of whom I barely knew? That wasn't my idea of a good time. Kelly had always been the social butterfly, the kind of person who effortlessly drew others in. Her energy was infectious, a warmth that made people gravitate toward her. Me? I was the complete opposite. I preferred my own company, or at most, the presence of 1 or 2 others. Being part of a group always felt awkward and draining, like I was out of sync with the rhythm everyone else seemed to share. Kelly and I had been dating for about 8 months at that point. Things between us were great. She made me feel like I belonged by her side, like she saw the best in me even when I didn't see it myself. But her friends? I'd only known them for about 5 months, and honestly, I still felt like an outsider most of the time. They all had this history together, inside jokes, shared adventures, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the new guy trying to catch up. The group consisted of 4 couples. There was Kelly and I, her ex-boyfriend Vic, and his new girlfriend Michelle, a ditzy city girl who was completely out of her element in the woods. Zeke, the quirky, nerdy guy who always seemed to have a sarcastic comment ready, and his girlfriend Rebecca, who looked like she had walked straight off the cover of a fashion magazine. And finally, Sam and Jamie, the adventurous couple, as Kelly used to call them. Sam loved pushing boundaries, and Jamie usually just went along with it, even when it was clear she didn't want to. Out of everyone, Vic was the one who made things difficult for me. Vic was a problem. He and Kelly had broken up 2 years ago, but the way he carried himself, you'd think it was fresh. Being around him was a challenge I hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't just awkward, it was unnerving. There's a certain vulnerability that comes with knowing someone else shares intimate memories with the person you care about, and Vic exploited that with precision. He had a knack for slipping in sly comments, little jabs wrapped in casual conversation. He'd bring up old stories, adventures he and Kelly had shared, places they'd been together, and then glance my way, as if to remind me I wasn't part of those moments. Worse, he'd smirk and toss out lines like, "Oh, Kevin wouldn't get that one," before turning to Kelly for validation. "Right, Kelly?" She would smile politely or brush him off, doing her best to ease the tension, but every time she did, it only fueled my irritation. The worst part was knowing he was doing it on purpose. Vic wasn't subtle about staking his claim on their shared past, and it left me torn between wanting to call him out and not wanting to ruin the upcoming trip for Kelly. She had this incredible ability to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. It was one of the things I loved most about her, but in moments like this, it was maddening. I tried to brush it off, to focus on the fact that Kelly had chosen me, not him. But being around Vic was something I couldn't quite get used to. There was a discomfort that lingered, unshakable, in the back of my mind. Sharing space with someone who had once been intimate with my girlfriend felt like standing on uneasy ground. Every comment, every subtle reminder of their history, stirred emotions I didn't want to confront. Resentment, insecurity, maybe both. Then he crossed a line, boldly mentioning Kelly's birthmark on the inside of her upper thigh in front of the group. It was a pointed jab, calculated and cruel, disguised as an offhand remark. Still, I forced myself to swallow the anger bubbling inside and told myself to let it go. But no matter how hard I tried, each encounter left its mark. carving deeper into my patience and resolve. The drive to the trailhead was a mix of scenic beauty and the kind of casual chaos you'd expect from a group like ours. We caravanned in 3 cars, winding through narrow mountain roads lined with towering evergreens. Zeke was in the lead, his old Subaru packed to the brim with camping gear, while Vic's shiny SUV followed closely behind, its tires kicking up dust. Kelly and I were in the middle car, her music playlist alternating between upbeat pop and classic rock. She kept turning to me with a smile, trying to get me to sing along, but I wasn't much for singing in front of people, not even her yet. The others had their windows down, shouting back and forth between cars at stop signs. Sam made a game out of honking his horn in rhythm to whatever song was playing, and Rebecca leaned out of Zeke's car window at one point to snap a picture of the convoy. It was lighthearted, fun, almost enough to make me forget how out of place I felt in their world of inside jokes and shared memories. Almost. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low. We unloaded our gear, strapped on our backpacks, and started the hike into the forest. The trail was vibrant, surrounded by lush greenery and the sounds of birds chirping overhead. The forest felt alive and welcoming, with beams of sunlight streaming through the canopy above. Zeke made a joke about us being the first people to discover the place, and this time, we all laughed. The upbeat mood was infectious, and even I started to feel more relaxed. After what felt like hours, we found a clearing big enough for all our tents. It was surrounded by towering trees, their branches knitting together overhead to form a canopy that shaded the area in a peaceful glow. We set up camp quickly, laughing and joking as we worked together. Sam and Jamie started a fire, and soon we were all sitting around it, the flickering flames casting warm, inviting light across the clearing. The first night was uneventful in the best way possible. Everyone was in high spirits, sharing stories and laughing around the campfire. Most of the jokes were inside ones, things that had happened on past trips that I hadn't been a part of. More than once, Vic made a point of reminding me of that. "You wouldn't know about that one, Kevin," he'd say with a smirk. "Right, Kelly?" He'd glance at her, and she'd just smile awkwardly, not wanting to feed into it. The others would laugh, but it only made me feel more out of place. Kelly reached over and squeezed my hand, her face glowing in the firelight. "This is nice, isn't it?" she said. And for the first time, I agreed. Despite Vic's jabs, the forest had a calming effect, and I started to think this trip might not be so bad after all. The next morning, we set out on a hike to a waterfall Zeke had been talking about since we started planning the trip. The trail was narrow and winding, forcing us to walk in single file. Kelly and I stayed near the middle, and I caught her stealing glances at me, her soft smile making the soreness in my legs feel worth it. When we reached the waterfall, it was everything Zeke had promised. A cascade of clear water tumbled over moss-covered rocks, pooling into a small stream below. The group cheered and started unpacking lunch. Some of them stripped down and jumped into the water, laughing and splashing like kids. Kelly and I used the moment to steal away, finding a quiet spot by the water's edge. We talked about everything and nothing, her head resting on my shoulder as we listened to the rush of the falls. For the first time since the trip began, I felt like I belonged. Our moment was interrupted when Zeke called out, his voice excited. "Hey guys, check this out!" We walked over to find him, Sam and Vic gathered near the base of the falls. Zeke pointed to a shadowy opening behind the cascading water. "There's a cave back there," he said, his eyes wide with excitement. The girls immediately voiced their concerns. "You don't know what's in there," Jamie said, crossing her arms. "It could be dangerous." I chimed in, trying to sound calm but firm. "They're right. It's not a good idea. You don't know how stable it is or what's inside." Vic scoffed, a grin spreading across his face. "What's the matter, Kevin? Scared of the dark? Don't worry, we'll hold your hand." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice calm. It's called using my intelligence and common sense, Vic. Something you might want to try sometime. Rebecca stepped in, her tone soothing. Okay, let's not fight. If they want to check it out, let them. Just don't take too long, okay? The guys disappeared behind the falls, their voices fading as they ventured deeper into the cave. The rest of us started packing up, thinking they'd only be gone a few minutes. 20 minutes later, they came stumbling out, their faces pale. What happened? Kelly asked, rushing over to Zeke, who looked like he was about to collapse. We found a chamber, Zeke said, his voice trembling. It was full of bones. Deer, elk, mountain lions. But there were others too. He hesitated, glancing around at the group. I think I saw human skulls. Vic waved him off. It was too dark to see anything clearly. Don't listen to him. It's just an old cave. Nothing to worry about. The group fell silent, the weight of Zeke's words hanging in the air. Without another word, we started the hike back to camp. The hike back to camp felt heavier somehow, like the forest itself was watching us. I tried to shake the thought, telling myself it was just Zeke's imagination getting to me. But as much as I wanted to believe Vic's dismissive attitude, I couldn't forget the way Zeke's voice had trembled when he talked about those bones. He wasn't the kind of guy to scare easily. Kelly must have noticed the tension in my face because she slipped her hand into mine as we walked. Do you think Zeke was telling the truth? She asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, not wanting to scare her more than she already was. But lying didn't feel right either. Yeah, I said finally. I think he saw something real, and I think we need to be careful. She nodded, her grip tightening. For a while, we didn't say anything else, just followed the others as they laughed and joked ahead of us. It was surreal, the way they could act like nothing had happened. Even Zeke, who had been so shaken, was starting to laugh along with Sam and Vic again, though he didn't seem quite as enthusiastic. We got back to camp. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. We lit the fire again, and the group began preparing dinner. The mood lifted somewhat, with Sam cracking jokes and Michelle telling a story about how she'd once brought an inflatable mattress on a camping trip and tried to float it down a river. Everyone roared with laughter, even Zeke, though I noticed he kept glancing toward the tree line. As we ate, my eyes kept drifting to the darkness beyond the firelight. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My thoughts kept drifting back to the cave, fixating on the trace of human scent we might have left behind. What if whatever lived in that cave followed us back here? This wasn't unheard of. It had happened before. There were documented cases of people unknowingly wandering into a den or hunting ground, only for the territorial animal to track their scent back to their camp. Then the noises started. At first it was faint, rustling in the bushes, like something moving just out of sight. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe small animals, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, branches snapping, heavy footfalls. Kelly noticed it too, her hand gripping mine tightly. Then, we heard it. A faint, low growl that seemed to vibrate through us, sharp and unnerving. Do you hear that? She whispered, her voice shaking. Yeah, I said, keeping my voice low. Stay close. The others were still chatting and laughing, oblivious to the sounds creeping closer. Then I saw them. 2 yellow eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My breath caught in my throat. There's something out there, I said, louder than I meant to. Everyone stopped talking, their heads turning to look at me. What are you talking about? Vic asked, his tone dismissive. I pointed toward the trees. By those trees, I saw eyes. Vic snorted. Oh, come on, Kevin. You're scared of the dark now? It's just your imagination. I raised an eyebrow and shot back. Right, Vic. Because my imagination is out there snapping branches and growling in the dark. Guess yours just isn't working hard enough. The whole time my eyes stayed locked on the spot where the glow had been, but it was gone now. Kelly moved closer to me, her hand trembling as she whispered, "I believe you." Vic leaned back against a log, smirking. "You need to relax, Kevin. We're in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing out here but deer and squirrels." But I knew better. Something was out there, watching us, and it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. The laughter around the fire was subdued after that. Everyone tried to act like nothing was wrong, but I could tell they were spooked, even Vic. We all stayed close to the fire, the flickering light our only comfort in the growing darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat by the fire, staring into the woods, waiting for those eyes to come back. The next morning, as the sun rose and cast its pale light over the camp, Zeke froze mid-step. Guys?" he said, pointing to the ground near the fire pit. We all turned to see what he was looking at. Tracks. Deep, heavy prints cut straight through the middle of our campsite. They were long and narrow, with sharp claw marks gouging into the dirt. Whatever had made them had walked directly past our tents while we were sitting by the fire. "What kind of animal leaves tracks like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca crouched down, studying the marks. "Maybe a bear?" "No," Zeke said, his voice trembling. "That's not a bear. Look at the claws. Look how deep they are. That's something else." The discovery put everyone on edge, but Vic continued to dismiss it, calling the tracks a coincidence and insisting we just needed to chill. We set off for the hike Zeke had planned earlier, determined to stick to the day's schedule and not let fear ruin the trip. The forest felt different now, though. The sunlight didn't feel as warm, and the birds were quieter. Kelly stuck close to me, her nervous energy matching my own. Even Zeke, who usually walked at the front of the group, kept looking over his shoulder. We were about an hour into the hike when someone noticed Michelle wasn't with us. At first, it didn't feel serious. We'd been walking in single file, the trail winding through dense forest, and it wasn't unusual for someone to fall behind or stop to take a picture. But when we called her name and got no answer, a strange unease settled over the group. "She was right behind me a minute ago," Jamie said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Vic shrugged, clearly unconcerned. "She probably just stopped to fix her shoe or something. You know how she is." Kelly shot him a sharp look. She wouldn't just wander off without saying something. We waited for a few minutes, expecting her to appear around the bend in the trail. The silence grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, Jamie turned to the group, her voice trembling. "We need to go back and look for her." Vic groaned. "She's fine. She probably got distracted by some flowers or a butterfly. Give her a few minutes." "We're not just going to wait here," I said, stepping forward. "If she's lost or hurt, we need to find her now." Reluctantly, the group turned back the way we'd come, retracing our steps and calling Michelle's name. The forest seemed quieter than before, the air heavier. Kelly stayed close to me, her hand brushing against mine as we walked. It wasn't long before we found one of her boots lying on the ground near the edge of the trail. It was caked with dirt, the laces torn as though they had been ripped off in a struggle. The sight of it made my stomach drop. "Her boot?" Rebecca whispered, her voice trembling. She looked around, her hands gripping Zeke's arm tightly. "Why would she leave her boot?" Zeke picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "This doesn't make sense. She wouldn't just lose this and keep walking." The unease in the group was palpable now. Jamie hugged herself, her eyes scanning the trees. This isn't like her." Vic, who had been brushing everything off until now, crouched down beside the boot. For the first time, his smirk was gone. He stared at the torn laces and then at the surrounding forest, his brow furrowing. "Okay, this is weird," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Kelly's eyes widened. "Weird? That's all you have to say?" Michelle's missing, Vic." "I know," he snapped, standing abruptly. "You think I don't care? I just—" He trailed off, glancing at the boot again. "I don't know. Maybe we should get back to camp, regroup, and figure out what to do next." The shift in Vic's tone unnerved me. For someone who'd spent most of the trip playing the tough guy, his sudden uncertainty sent a chill through the group. Zeke nodded quickly, his voice trembling. "He's right. Let's get back. We're not going to find her out here. Not like this." The group fell silent. Even Sam, who usually followed Vic's lead, looked shaken. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees taller, the shadows deeper. For the first time, I saw fear in everyone's eyes. "We need to go," Zeke said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get back to camp." No one argued. We moved quickly, sticking closer together than before. The forest felt different now, colder somehow. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made us jump. And through it all, one thought kept running through my mind. Michelle wasn't lost, she was taken. And whatever had taken her wasn't far away. The hike back to camp was quiet. Too quiet. No one spoke except for the occasional whispered call of Michelle's name, but the forest swallowed the sound. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her disappearance pressing down on all of us. Kelly stayed close to me, her hand gripping mine tightly. I could feel her trembling, though she tried to hide it. Vic led the group, his earlier confidence replaced with a sharp edge of urgency. Even Sam, usually the first to make light of any situation, kept glancing over his shoulder. Zeke and Rebecca stayed close together, their eyes darting toward every rustle in the trees. Jamie walked behind us, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her fear at bay. When we finally reached the campsite, the sight of the clearing should have been a relief. But it wasn't. The air felt wrong, thicker, heavier. The fire pit from the night before was cold, the logs still in a messy pile where we'd left them. The shadows beneath the trees seemed darker than they should have been, even in the early afternoon light. "We'll figure this out," Vic said, turning to face the group. His voice was steadier now, but his eyes betrayed him. "We'll call for help. Someone has to have a signal." Zeke shook his head. "We're too deep in the forest. We haven't had a signal since yesterday." Rebecca tugged on his sleeve. "There has to be something we can do. We can't just sit here." I glanced at Kelly, who looked at me with wide, questioning eyes. "We should keep the fire going," I said, my voice steady but low. "Whatever's out there, I don't think it'll come near if we stay in the light." Vic gave me a sharp, "There is nothing out there, Kevin. Keep your bullshit imaginative stories to yourself. This is serious. My girlfriend is missing." He turned to Sam. "You and I will look around the perimeter, see if there's anything out of place." "Out of place?" Kelly asked, her voice rising. "What does that even mean, Vic? Michelle is missing, and you want to wander around the woods?" "We're not wandering," Vic shot back. "We're checking the area, unless you think sitting here is going to magically bring her back." Kelly opened her mouth to respond, but I put a hand on her shoulder. "Let them go. We'll stay here and get the fire started." She hesitated, then nodded. Vic and Sam disappeared into the trees, leaving the rest of us in an uneasy silence. Zeke and Rebecca began gathering wood while Jamie sat near the fire pit, staring at the ground as if willing Michelle to walk back into camp. The fire crackled to life just as the sun began to sink lower in the sky. Its warmth did little to ease the cold knot in my stomach. Kelly sat close to me, her shoulder brushing mine, while Zeke and Rebecca whispered quietly on the other side of the flames. Jamie still hadn't moved. When Vic and Sam returned, their faces were grim. "Nothing," Vic said, dropping heavily onto a log. "No tracks, no sign of anything. It's like she just vanished." "Maybe she did," Jamie said, her voice flat and hollow. Everyone turned to look at her, but she didn't elaborate. The fire popped and crackled, filling the silence that followed. I stared into the flames, my mind racing. The tracks we'd seen earlier, the noises in the woods, the eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken Michelle wasn't done with us. "We need to stay together," I said finally, breaking the silence. "No one goes off alone. Not for any reason." For once, no one argued. The night dragged on, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire or a distant snap of a branch. Each sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, but I stayed seated, staring into the darkness. Even Vic, despite his dismissive tone, seemed tense. His shoulders were stiff, and he kept glancing over at the trees, as if he were trying to catch a glimpse of something he was too proud to admit he feared. Kelly sat close, her hand gripping mine tightly, her eyes darting around the campsite. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jamie broke the silence. "Maybe we should turn in for the night," she said, her voice trembling. "If we're all together in the tents, we'll feel safer." Vic rolled his eyes. "We're not in some horror movie. There's nothing out there. It's just the woods. You all are letting Kevin's paranoia get to you." "Paranoia?" I said, unable to hide the edge in my voice. "We've seen tracks around our camp, we've heard noises, and I saw eyes. You can keep denying it, but something's out there, Vic." "Enough!" Vic snapped, standing abruptly. His voice was louder than it needed to be, almost like he was trying to convince himself. "There is nothing out there. Stop trying to scare everyone." Before I could respond, Zeke stood up, his voice shaking. "You don't know that, Vic. You didn't see those bones in the cave like I did. There were skulls, human skulls. Something put them there." "Zeke, shut up," Vic barked, his face red. "You're all acting like kids. Michelle is out there lost, and we're wasting time sitting around talking about monsters." Kelly opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, there was a sound. A chime echoed from the dark forest, its sound crisp and out of place. Vic shot to his feet, instantly alert. "That's Michelle's ringtone," he said, his voice laced with sudden hope. For a moment, the possibility that it was her filled us with relief. But as we listened, the ringing grew louder, closer. Then, without warning, it shifted, now coming from the opposite side of the camp. We froze. Within moments, it moved again, this time from yet another direction. Our heads snapped toward each new source of the sound, turning frantically as the ringtone circled us, always just beyond the firelight, always just out of reach. Then we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It reverberated through the air, silencing all of us. "What the hell was that?" Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. No one answered. We all sat frozen, our eyes locked on the edge of the trees. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows, and then it happened. There was a blur of motion, too fast to process, and a scream that cut through the night like a knife. Rebecca was yanked backward, her chair toppling as she disappeared into the darkness. Zeke lunged after her, his voice breaking as he screamed her name. "Rebecca!" Sam grabbed Zeke before he could follow, pulling him back toward the fire. "You can't go out there," he yelled. "You'll get yourself killed." "Let me go. We have to save her." Zeke thrashed in Sam's grip, tears streaming down his face. Vic stood frozen, his face pale and his hands trembling. For all his bravado, he was shaken to his core. What the hell just happened?" he stammered. I looked at him, my patience gone. "What happened, Vic?" "Something dragged Rebecca into the woods. That's what happened. Do you believe me now?" He didn't respond. He just stared into the trees, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "We can't stay here," Kelly said, her voice breaking. "We have to go." "She's right," Zeke said, his voice raw. "We need to get out of here. Now." I nodded, my mind racing. "Grab what you can carry. We're heading back to the cars. No one goes anywhere alone." The group scrambled to pack up, the fire casting flickering shadows that felt like they were closing in on us. My heart pounded as I gathered my things, Kelly at my side. At this point, we all knew we were being watched, that whatever had taken Rebecca was still out there, waiting. And I knew that it wouldn't stop with her. The forest swallowed every sound except the frenzied rustling of bags and whispered arguments. The sense of urgency was palpable as everyone tried to stay calm, but the weight of Rebecca's disappearance hung heavy in the air. Vic barked orders as if trying to reassert control, but no one was really listening. Fear had taken hold. A feeling of guilt hung over us. We were getting the hell out of there without even attempting to help Rebecca. The look on Zeke's face said it all. I think we rationalized that we would get out of there and get help. "Stay close," I said to Kelly, pulling her toward me as we started down the trail. Zeke was clutching his pack like it was a lifeline, his eyes darting into the trees as if Rebecca might reappear at any moment. Vic lingered at the back, his walking stance ready for an attack, while Sam and Jamie walked ahead, tense and silent. We hadn't made it far when the first scream tore through the night. We spun toward the sound, but it was already too late. Sam's body was silhouetted against the moonlight as something massive yanked him into the air. He screamed again, but the sound was cut short by a sickening crunch that shrunk his silhouette. Then, with a horrendous tearing sound, we watched the creature pull his body apart and fling it. "Oh my God!" Jamie shrieked, stumbling back. "What is happening? What is happening?" "Run!" Zeke shouted, his voice cracking as he grabbed Jamie's arm. Kelly was frozen beside me, her eyes wide and unblinking. I yanked her forward, forcing her legs to move. Vic stood rooted to the spot, staring into the trees where Sam had disappeared. "Vic, move!" I yelled, but he didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling as he muttered something under his breath. I didn't have time to listen. Another growl rumbled through the forest, and Vic finally broke, sprinting down the trail ahead of us. We followed, the sound of crashing branches and heavy footfalls behind us growing louder with every step. We barely made it 100 feet when Vic tripped. He fell hard, his hands clawing at the dirt as he tried to scramble back up. I stopped instinctively, but Kelly, who didn't see me stop, kept running. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Vic looked up at me, his face pale and desperate. "Help me! My ankle!" he cried, reaching out. And then I saw it, glowing yellow eyes piercing the darkness, far closer than I had anticipated. The creature stepped forward just enough for its hulking form to take shape, moving with a chilling combination of raw power and unnatural grace. I froze, paralyzed between instinct and reason. Vic had always been a thorn in my side, and I knew, without a doubt, that if our roles were reversed, he wouldn't hesitate to keep running, leaving me to my fate. My focus narrowed to a single priority, getting Kelly and me out of there alive. I made my choice. "Kevin, please!" Vic screamed as I turned and ran off in the direction of Kelly. His screams were deafening, piercing the night, until they weren't. Silence fell again, more suffocating than ever. As I caught up to Kelly, I whispered, "Keep running," my voice breaking. Kelly sobbed as we stumbled down the uneven trail, the trees pressing in from all sides. In front of us, Jamie screamed. I looked up just in time to see her veer off the trail, her silhouette disappearing into the forest. "Jamie!" Zeke shouted, starting after her, but I grabbed his arm. "She's gone!" I yelled, barely able to get the words out. "We can't split up!" Tears streaked his face as he struggled against me, but he didn't fight for long. He knew I was right. We ran until we couldn't anymore, the trail vanishing beneath our feet as we plunged deeper into the woods. When we finally stopped, gasping for air, the silence was almost worse than the screams. Kelly clung to me, her body shaking as she sobbed into my chest. "We're not going to make it," Zeke whispered, his voice hollow. "We will," I said, though I didn't believe it. "We just have to keep moving." The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. We stumbled blindly through the forest, the creature's guttural growls haunting us from every direction. Kelly tripped several times, and I had to carry her for part of the way. Zeke was barely holding it together, his muttered prayers filling the gaps between his labored breaths. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, I felt a flicker of hope. We weren't out of danger, but daylight felt like armor, however thin. The growls had stopped, and the forest seemed to exhale with us. We didn't stop until we reached the dirt road where our cars were parked. Kelly collapsed onto the ground, her body racked and too exhausted to cry anymore. Zeke sat down heavily beside her, his face pale and his hands trembling. The urgency to get out of there was pulsing through me. I went over to my car and found the spare key in the magnetic key box under my wheel well. "I'll drive," I said, my voice barely audible. We all stumbled into the truck like half-dead corpses and took off. The long drive to the nearest establishment of civilization seemed to take a lifetime. The gas station felt like salvation when it finally appeared in the distance, its flickering lights cutting through the suffocating darkness. The attendant called the authorities, and the weeks that followed passed in a surreal blur. Our account of what happened was dismissed as absurd, labeled as hysteria or shock. But when we refused to change our story, the threats began. We were told we'd face criminal charges unless we backed the official narrative, a wolf attack. Reluctantly, the three of us realized that adopting the lie was the only way to put the nightmare behind us. Against every instinct, we buried the truth and told the world what they wanted to hear. As for the others, Vic, Jamie, Rebecca, Michelle, and Sam, no trace of them was ever found. They were simply devoured by a terror incarnate, leaving us to carry the weight of their deaths. In the aftermath, Zeke moved to New York City to live with his cousin, cutting off all contact. We never heard from him again. Kelly and I, however, became closer than I ever thought possible. In the years that followed, we married and started a new life in Vancouver, Canada, trying to build something normal out of the wreckage of that experience. But the trauma left its mark. Kelly was never the same. Losing so many of her closest friends in one horrific trip extinguished the light she used to carry. Once outgoing and full of life, she became quiet and withdrawn, almost as introverted as I was. Some would call the way we've made each other the center of our worlds unhealthy, and honestly, I can't disagree. But beneath the isolation lies a bond forged in survival, a love so deep, it's almost unbreakable. We both came terrifyingly close to losing each other that night, and the scars of that fear are something we'll carry forever. Still, I hold a secret, one tied to a guilt that gnaws at me. I might have been able to save Vic. Maybe if I had tried, he would have survived. Or maybe we both would have died. The truth is, the decision I made that night, to leave him behind, is the reason I'm alive today. The reason I have a life with Kelly. It's a haunting thought, but one of the few that allows me to sleep at night. Kelly, however, hasn't escaped unscathed. From time to time, she wakes in the middle of the night screaming from the same recurring nightmare. In it, she's running through the woods alone, her friends' desperate screams echoing around her as the growling creature closes in. Last night, though, something strange happened. As she bolted upright screaming, I swear I heard it too. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the darkness. Even now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that we didn't leave everything behind in those woods. My only advice: stay within the bounds of civilization, and among other people. They say man is the true monster. I highly disagree with that.